I'm going to introduce a framework which has two pillars which are fundamental. The first pillar is an asymmetry between human and physical capital. And the second pillar is going to make a distinction between two kinds of capital, which I'm going to call machine capital and robot capital. Okay, first pillar first. This is what you will write down when you write down a standard macro model of the solar variety where the inputs are getting accumulated over time. I put in two inputs for you. The physical capital input, that's the solar equation that all of you know from any textbook. And that is a human capital growth input. That's coming from, let's say, any obvious extension of the solar model, Mankiw, Romer, and Weil, any standard macro model, you'll have human capital accumulating in that fashion. And what I want to do is put a big question mark underneath that second equation. What does it even mean to have that second equation? Yeah? Now, one thing about physical capital is that it's alienable, right? We can all own shares of Reliance or Apple. We can scale up those shares to any degree we want. Yeah. What does it mean for an inalienable input like human capital? I can't own shares in your human capital. I can only own shares in my human capital. What does it mean to scale it up and down in the same fashion? And the answer is, man, like, don't be silly, all this is just a shorthand for education, and you can just acquire more education. That's what it's trying to capture. But it's not so easy if you think about it. Yeah, it doesn't mean that if you are, let's say, if you have a particular job in banking, you're just going to become a better and better and better banker. Right? To some extent, you can become a better banker, right? You can become a better economist, though that may be even more doubtful, right? But you can maybe move up and down in a particular sector. But the main way human capital is accumulated or taken over time is that we move from one sector to another. Maybe not us economists, right? But ordinary human beings, that's the way they go, right? They start out in a particular occupation, then they move to another occupation, they become a manager, whatever. That's the accumulation of human. But now, when you start thinking about human capital in that way, you realize that writing down an aggregate equation like that is profoundly misleading. And the reason it's misleading is that these occupational movements all have endogenous relative prices associated with them. And those prices are going to change over time, right? We have to track those prices. And if we write down an aggregate equation like that, you're not going to be able to track them. Now you might say, oh, are you trying to, resurrect the Cambridge controversy with Joan Robinson and all of that? The answer is yes and no, okay? But I'm going to show you why these movements in relative prices are very important. So we continue this way on. So this is the asymmetry that I want to try and capture, right? So human capital is inalienable, okay? And because it's inalienable, all claims to it has to be embodied in one body, right? It has to be embodied in one body, and then you can move around and do things with it. Whereas physical capital is alienable, right? And we can just, we can put in more machines, we can own more machines, there's no problem. So the last line of this slide is the most important, which says that human capital to a first order is accumulated as we move across different occupations in the world. Yeah. So you might think, what has that to do with the price of milk? Okay, I'll come back to it, but just hold off on that. Let me get to the second point, which has to do with machines and robots, right? So machines and robots tries to capture the fact that they're not literally machines and robots, that physical capital has two aspects to it. The first aspect is that it's complementary with labor, right? You get to work with a computer, let's say, or with any kind of implement, and that increases the marginal product of labor, right? It's a complementary thing. And the second aspect of capital is that it has certain things in it, certain components that tend to displace labor, right? And I'm going to call these objects machines and robots.